noticed that the children were gone. Immediately jumped in the vehicle, surveyed all the areas, many dirt roads, many culverts as I could, and waited for the police to get there.
Jack and Lilly Sullivan, 2 young children, vanished. No witnesses, no surveillance, no Amber Alert. Their mother said they were just playing. Their stepfather said he never heard a thing. The door was open, then it was closed. The timeline was inconsistent. The stories kept changing, the photos looked edited, the children looked thin, their faces tired, their eyes hollow. And from day one, suspicions weren't aimed at strangers. They were aimed at home, at the very people who were supposed to protect them. So what really happened to Jack and Lilly? Let's take a step back and look at the case as a whole. Over a month has passed, and what we know comes only from official statements, a handful of confirmed details, and the timeline released by investigators. On the morning of Friday, May 2nd, 2025, 6-year-old Lilly and 4-year-old Jack Sullivan were reported missing from their rural home on Gearlock Road, Lansdowne Station, Nova Scotia. At 10 a.m., their mother, Malia Brooks Murray, called 911 and said her children had disappeared. According to Malia's initial statement, she heard the children playing in the room next to hers earlier that morning, then went back to sleep. When she woke up, both Lilly and Jack were gone. She called the police immediately. Daniel Martell, the children's stepfather, also gave his account. He claimed that Lilly came into his room a few times that morning, while Jack could be heard playing downstairs in the kitchen. Then, at some point, the house went quiet. When Daniel went to check, he noticed the back patio door was left slightly open, and the kids were gone. Within hours, the RCMP issued a vulnerable missing persons advisory for Pictou County. However, they chose not to issue an Amber Alert, citing a lack of evidence of abduction, a decision that would later draw public criticism, particularly from indigenous communities. Members of the Sapatic First Nation and other communities were infuriated, believing the response would have been swifter if the children had been white. Critics accused the RCMP of racial bias and apathy, and despite the gravity of the situation, no Amber Alert was ever issued. The advisory stayed local, and so did the questions. Daniel, who normally worked weekdays, was coincidentally off that day, saying his workload had slowed down. No one else was in the house, just Daniel, Malia, their infant daughter Meadow, and the 2 missing children. The only physical clue was a small child's footprint about 10 feet behind the house. But it didn't lead to the road. It didn't point anywhere. It simply stopped. When investigators arrived, they found no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no struggle, no blood, no clear evidence of abduction. Just a door that may, or may not, have been left open. Most concerning of all, there were no confirmed sightings of Lilly or Jack after the afternoon of May 1st. No one outside the household had seen them since then. In fact, both children had already missed school for 3 days before their disappearance, with the explanation given that Lilly had a cough. That meant their last public appearance was May 1st. Everything after that came only from the parents. Malia and Daniel's statements didn't fully align either. Was the back door open without a sound, or did someone hear it? Their accounts kept shifting. From the start, the timeline raised questions. Even Daniel admitted that the 10 a.m. report time was probably inaccurate. The children may have gone missing earlier. Malia herself told a relative via text, "They don't understand stranger danger. If someone stopped in the front yard and told them to come over, they would." This, too, contradicted earlier claims that the children never left the backyard. In a private message later revealed, Daniel wrote, "They wandered off. They just walked away." His statement alarmed many, as it seemed to downplay the severity of the situation. Lilly and Jack had never shown a pattern of wandering off. There were no behavioral concerns, no warnings from schools, doctors, or social workers. They were not the kind of children to simply walk away alone. Family tensions escalated. Daniel claimed that Malia's relatives accused him on the very first day. He said his own mother had to remove people from the property. Such immediate suspicion from close relatives suggested pre-existing distrust, perhaps even awareness of prior issues in the home. The public response, however, was overwhelming. More than 160 people, including police K-9 units and drone teams, joined the search. Volunteers poured in, logging an estimated 10,000 hours of search time in the first 3 weeks. Yet, there were no sightings, no tips that led anywhere, and no items belonging to the children were recovered. The timeline felt increasingly scripted. There was no mention of what happened the night before, who put the children to bed, or if they were even seen that morning. No neighbors heard or saw anything unusual. Even the use of search dogs was delayed. The first few hours, considered the most crucial in missing persons cases, were spent treating it as a non-criminal disappearance. Valuable time may have been lost. The house had no security cameras. No surrounding homes captured anything, and despite massive media coverage, not a single credible sighting ever emerged. Over a month later, there were still no solid leads, no arrests, no charges, no bodies, no answers. And from the very first day, suspicion wasn't directed at strangers. It was directed inward, at the people who lived in that house, at the ones who were supposed to protect them. Inside that house was Malaya Brooks Murray, a young mother of 2. Lily, 6 years old, and Jack, 4. Her children were from a previous relationship. Malaya belonged to the Sea-Pecnicotic First Nation, a Mi'kmaq community in Nova Scotia. Before meeting Daniel, she was a single mother raising Lily and Jack on her own. Daniel Martell entered her life sometime around 2022, based on the estimated age of their daughter Meadow, who was born in 2023. No exact timeline has been made public, but it's understood the relationship developed quickly. Soon after meeting Daniel, Malaya moved into his home, a remote, isolated property deep in the woods of Gearlock Road, Lansdowne Station. The couple lived there with Lily, Jack, and later baby Meadow. Daniel became a stepfather to the 2 older children and the biological father of the youngest. They lived far from neighbors, far from town, and even farther from Malaya's own family. According to relatives, she grew distant after moving in with Daniel. Contact became rare, and the kids were seldom seen. Daniel Martell was known in the community as a reserved, quiet man. He worked, or used to work, in the local lumber or trades industry. But some answers came only in whispers. Messages leaked online revealed concerns about Daniel's past. One person, allegedly close to the family, wrote, "He has a past with drugs, that's known, and he's not exactly off it either." Others claimed Daniel had once used or even sold meth. Nothing has been confirmed by police, but the claims were repeated enough to suggest his reputation was complicated at best. That reputation may have been part of why Malaya's family didn't trust him. Daniel himself admitted that her relatives confronted him the very day the kids were reported missing. "My mom had to kick people off the property," he said in one message. The distrust didn't begin with the disappearance. It was already there. The Sullivan household was tucked away deep in the rural back roads of Gearlock Road, Lansdowne Station, Nova Scotia. It stood far removed from neighbors, oversight, or casual witnesses. The house was surrounded by woods, far from the nearest paved road. "It's not even on proper pavement, hard to get to, especially in winter," one local would later say. Anyone wanting to visit had to go out of their way. Strangers rarely passed through. There were no neighbors to casually notice what went on. It was a place perfectly suited for isolation. 5 people lived inside. Daniel Martell, the stepfather, Malaya Brooks Murray, the mother, her 2 older children, Lily, 6, and Jack, 4, and Meadow, their baby daughter under 2. There were no visitors, no one outside the family to see what daily life was like. The home had a sliding back patio door, which Daniel claimed was open the morning Lily and Jack disappeared. But that door wasn't connected to any security system. In fact, there were no cameras, no alarms, no doorbell footage. From the outside, the house gave no clue who lived there or what their days looked like. Inside, the house was described as dim. One visitor said it felt dark, not just in terms of lighting, but in mood. Another noted there were no toys in the yard, no swing set, no tricycles, no sign that 3 children lived there at all. The silence wasn't just outside, it was inside too. Communication from the home was limited. They don't even have regular service. Can't always get texts through, someone close to the family shared. Without Wi-Fi or consistent phone reception, the family existed largely off the grid. There were no signs of regular school attendance, doctor visits, or social interaction. In fact, the children hadn't been seen by anyone outside the home since the afternoon of May 1st. They hadn't been to school since Tuesday of that week, 3 days before the disappearance, reportedly because Lilly had a cough. There were no recent photos of the children. The ones shared after they vanished were months old. Extended family hadn't seen Lilly or Jack in over a year. "She doesn't go out, just stays inside," said a former friend of Malaya. Whether by choice or circumstance, the mother had become increasingly withdrawn. The home had turned into its own ecosystem, cut off, silent, self-contained. And when Daniel told people he controlled everything in the house, even the lights, that wasn't just a throwaway comment. In a place with no internet, no visitors, and no oversight, even something as simple as who turned on a lamp carried a different weight. Financially, the household operated in the shadows as well. Daniel claimed to work in local trades, but he wasn't working at the time of the children's disappearance. Malaya didn't work at all. There was no public information about social support, income, or how they sustained daily life. It raised uncomfortable questions about how the family managed and what resources they truly had. When the children were reported missing, search teams arrived at a scene that felt frozen in place. No signs of a struggle, no broken furniture, no blood, no noise complaints, no screams heard, just a back door supposedly left open, and a single child's footprint found about 10 feet from the house. Signs of control and abuse. It's important to note that these signs, while deeply unsettling, remain circumstantial. No official medical records or eyewitness testimony have confirmed abuse at this stage. Everything we see so far points to suspicion, not proof, but the number of red flags surrounding Lilly and Jack Sullivan cannot be ignored. One of the most disturbing images came from a photo of Lilly holding her baby sister. People immediately noticed something was off. Her arms were shockingly thin. Her arms are the same width from shoulder to wrist. That's a red flag in child starvation. Indeed, medical professionals note that when a child's arm does not taper, with no visible fat or muscle, it can indicate serious malnutrition. This wasn't just a skinny child. This was a clinical red flag. Lilly's hands raised other concerns as well. In a photo from December, observers noticed her fingernails were caked with dirt, highly unusual for a young child indoors during a cold Nova Scotia winter. This wasn't simply about playing outside. It suggested a deeper problem: poor hygiene, neglect, or even a situation where the child had to care for herself in an unclean environment. That kind of disparity in care isn't accidental. In many child welfare cases, it points to intentional neglect and unequal treatment based on blood relation. Her step-siblings, Lilly and Jack, the children from Malaya's previous relationship, looked malnourished, tired, and overlooked. Baby Meadow, the biological child of Daniel and Malaya, appeared well-fed, healthy, and clean in every image. Another chilling detail comes from comparisons between the children. It was as if the space had been scrubbed, not just cleaned, but erased. Investigators didn't find signs of a struggle, but they also didn't find the usual mess of a home with children. Even the home environment reflected warning signs. When search crews entered the property after the disappearance, they found no toys, no backpacks, no personalized belongings for the children, no favorite blankets, no books. Nothing that suggested 2 young kids had been living there. If true, it would fit with Jack's underweight frame and his seemingly withdrawn demeanor. This claim, while unverified, aligns with textbook psychological abuse, using food as a means of control. One person claiming to know the family wrote, "They would withhold meals if Jack didn't behave." Rumors from within the community suggested even darker possibilities. Experts in abuse cases often see it in children who've been coerced, threatened, or forced to pose for photos while under stress. It's a concept known as emotional incongruence, when the eyes and the mouth don't match. They look like they've been told to smile, one observer noted. Online sleuths and former professionals pointed out the obvious. The kids weren't smiling with their eyes. Then there's the matter of how the children appeared in photos, not just physically, but emotionally. The silence from the school system only adds to the unease. Across all media reports and police briefings, there has been no official statement from any preschool, school, or elementary institution regarding Lilly or Jack. This opens up a troubling possibility. Perhaps the children hadn't been attending school regularly. Perhaps they'd been pulled out long before anyone even realized they were gone. That would expand the possible window of disappearance to well before May 2nd. A diet like that, if sustained over time, would absolutely lead to the kind of physical decline seen in both children. All they had in the house was cereal. That's what they fed the kids. No fruits, no vegetables, no proteins. Nutrition was another concern. A local who had once brought food to the family recalled, "Markers like that can be signs of emotional trauma, chronic fear, or even early PTSD. It's not a diagnosis, but it's a flashing yellow light." They said he would hide behind his sister. A relative noted that Jack was clinging and nervous, especially around strangers or loud noises. A child who can't clearly communicate is harder to protect and easier to isolate. If true, Jack may have been nonverbal or developmentally delayed, a condition that would have made him even more vulnerable. There's more. Daniel himself once wrote, "Jack doesn't talk much. He mostly grunts or makes sounds." And lastly, one neighbor admitted to hearing shouting from the house. Sometimes you could hear yelling if you got close, but most folks kept to themselves. Out there, it was rural, isolated, and like many remote places, people didn't want to interfere. The children weren't the only alleged victims. One of the earliest and most consistent red flags in this case was the isolation of Malaya Brooks Murray, physical, familial, social, psychological, and financial. Before the disappearance of Lilly and Jack, it appears Malaya herself had already disappeared in plain sight. As mentioned, they lived off Gearlock Road in Lansdowne Station, Nova Scotia. The house wasn't just rural, it was buried down an unpaved road surrounded by forest, far from anyone who might drop by unannounced. As one local put it, "That place is way out on Gearlock Road, not paved, hard to reach, especially in winter." There were no neighbors to hear anything, no cameras, no witnesses. Anyone who wanted to see them had to be invited, and Daniel Martell decided who got invited. The digital isolation was just as stark. Their home didn't have consistent internet service. That meant no FaceTime calls, no regular social media updates, no easy way for loved ones to casually check in. It also meant that if Malaya needed help, there was no simple way to ask for it. The house became a black hole. Nothing came out. That void extended to family. According to both her mother and her sister, Malaya and the kids hadn't been seen in over a year. One of them said, "We haven't seen the kids since early last year. Every attempt to visit was met with excuses. Every time we asked to visit, there was always an excuse." The pattern was unmistakable. After she met Daniel, Malaya stopped attending family dinners. She stopped returning calls. She stopped showing up. A relative summed it up. "She just disappeared from us. That's not natural. That's isolation." Even within her own community, the Sepeknikotic First Nation, she became a stranger. No one had recent contact. No one saw her at local gatherings. No one knew what was happening in her life. And online, She went dark. Her social media fell silent. When the kids were reported missing, every photo posted was old, months, sometimes a year outdated. There were no fresh images, no recent proof of daily life. It was as if time had stopped inside that house. A former friend said it best. She don't go out, just stays inside, keeps to herself. But the isolation didn't stop at geography or social interaction. There was also financial dependence, a crucial ingredient in behavioral control. Daniel claimed he didn't go to work on May 2nd because work had slowed down, yet no one could confirm what work he actually did or how he earned money. As for Malaya, there's no record of her holding a job, no mention of personal income, no bank account in her name, nothing to suggest financial autonomy. Everything, from food to clothing to baby supplies, was reportedly handled by Daniel. In his own words, "I took care of all of it." She didn't drive, she didn't go shopping, she had no means to leave even if she wanted to. This wasn't just circumstantial, it was structural. From the very start, Daniel Martell positioned himself not just as the spokesperson, but as the sole narrator. They wandered off. They just walked away, he said, before police, before media, before anyone even asked. He didn't wait for evidence. He didn't entertain other possibilities. He locked in a story, and no one else was allowed to tell a different one, not even their mother. Malaya Brooks Murray, the children's mother, was noticeably absent, not just physically, but vocally. She didn't speak to the press. She didn't write a post. She didn't appear in a single video pleading for help. Every piece of communication came from Daniel. He wrote the updates. He answered the questions. When someone asked how Malaya was doing, he replied, "She's resting. She agrees with me." Not once did she speak for herself. That's not grief. That's control. Daniel didn't just speak on her behalf. He claimed her silence as proof. "She doesn't want to talk. She's been through enough," he said, as if her voice no longer belonged to her, as if he was doing the world a favor by speaking for both. It's a strategy psychologists call coercive unification, using soft, reassuring language to make someone else disappear inside your own authority. Behind closed doors, Daniel's dominance went deeper. In one leaked message, he wrote, "They listen to me, not her." A chilling statement, not just about the children, but about household power. From money, to meals, to crisis response, Daniel called every shot. There was no evidence Malaya made independent decisions. In fact, when her own mother tried to visit, Daniel blocked her, then lashed out, "Stop accusing us. You weren't here." Even disagreement was rewritten. When a relative said the kids would never go near the road alone, Daniel snapped back, "They did it before. You just don't know because you weren't around." It's classic gaslighting, recasting reality, making others question their own memories, their own instincts. It's not just about lying. It's about owning the version of truth that gets believed. And he didn't stop there. He discouraged interference altogether. "Everyone needs to back off," he posted. "You don't live here." The message was clear. Outsiders don't get to ask questions, and they don't get to offer help. It's a tactic often seen in controlling relationships, building an emotional wall so high that even concern can't get through. It feels like betrayal. The only call Malaya may have made was to 911, and even that, we only know through Daniel's version. He called this protection. In one message, he wrote, "She doesn't need to talk to anyone right now, I'll handle it." To someone unfamiliar, it sounds like care. But in the context of isolation, silence, and control, it reads like capture. This wasn't shielding, it was smothering. And so the question remains, where was Malaya, not just in body, but in voice, in presence, in autonomy? Because in the weeks following her children's disappearance, one thing became painfully clear. Daniel didn't just control the house, he controlled the silence inside it, the broken family. In the weeks after Lilly and Jack disappeared, Malaya Brooks Murray left Daniel Martell. People in the community began to notice. One neighbor confirmed, "She's no longer living at that house. She left him." Another said she had moved back closer to her family. These weren't just rumors. They were repeated, consistent, and came from those who had been watching the case closely since day one. For more than a year, Malaya had been isolated, geographically, emotionally, and socially. Her family hadn't seen her or the children in over a year. As mentioned, her mother and sister said every attempt to visit was turned away with excuses. She stopped attending family dinners. She stopped answering messages. She just disappeared from their lives. And that disappearance wasn't just physical. It was psychological. Daniel spoke for her. He controlled every piece of communication with the outside world. He wrote the updates. He responded to comments. He explained her silence on her behalf. It was a textbook case of narrative control. But then, she left. There was no farewell post, no dramatic confrontation, just absence. And with it, Daniel's voice began to fade too. The man who once answered every comment, every question, suddenly went quiet. He stopped defending. He stopped narrating. He stopped speaking altogether. In controlling relationships, the power lies in containment. The house on Gearlock Road had been a fortress, rural, off the grid, no visitors, no neighbors, no cameras. Without Malaya in that space, Daniel lost more than just a partner. He lost control of the entire structure. She was no longer contained. And that meant something fundamental had changed. People began to speculate. Some believed she might be cooperating with authorities now. Others thought she had finally seen Daniel for who he really was. But one thing was undeniable. She was gone, and she left him behind. There's still no public statement from Malaya, but there might be a reason for that. According to multiple reports, the RCMP has advised her not to speak publicly at this stage of the investigation. It's a recommendation often made to protect the integrity of a case, and it could partially explain her silence, a silence so complete it has felt unsettling. But that raises another question. If the RCMP urged her not to speak, did they give the same warning to Daniel, or did he simply ignore it? Because while Malaya vanished from the public eye, Daniel was everywhere in the early days, writing statements, debating the public, framing the narrative. If he was told to stay quiet, he clearly didn't care. Or worse, maybe he was never told. And so, her silence stands out. It's no longer just a passive void. It's something to be examined. Something that might have been instructed, or something she chose. But either way, it doesn't belong to Daniel anymore. For months, he had been the only voice. He told the story. He controlled the pace. He controlled the details. The tone shifted. When Malaya walked away, the story broke. It lost its shape. It lost its narrator. The first and only time we heard from her directly was when she called 911 to report her children missing. That was the only confirmed action she took independently. Leaving Daniel may have been the second, and it may have been the most important one. We don't know what she's doing now. We don't know if she's working with police or staying silent for her own reasons. But we do know one thing. The woman who had once been absorbed into Daniel's voice, into his story, has, at least for now, stepped out of the frame. After the disappearance of Lilly and Jack, Daniel didn't respond with urgency or grief. Instead, he took a defensive posture, one that centered himself as the person suffering most. Slowly, but deliberately, he stopped being the concerned stepfather and started portraying himself as the victim of everyone else's suspicion. At first, he spoke confidently, controlling the narrative around the children's disappearance. But as pressure mounted, that confidence gave way to frustration. He began suggesting that the real harm was being done to him, by the media, by the public, even by Malaya's own family. "People keep coming for me like they know what happened. You weren't there. You don't know what we've been through," he said. The story, in his words, was no longer about the missing children. It was about how unfairly he was being treated. Daniel made himself the target. He complained about people judging him without knowing the full story, painting himself as misunderstood. In his eyes, he had done everything for the kids, and yet received nothing but blame. This was a calculated shift, a way to reframe growing scrutiny as persecution and criticism as cruelty. But the public didn't respond the way he might have hoped. Instead of sympathy, his words triggered skepticism. People began noticing the gap between what he said and how he acted. There was no visible grief, no raw emotion, no desperation to find the children. His statements felt flat, defensive, even cold, as though the performance didn't match the role he was trying to play. Community members began to question why Daniel was always the one speaking, while Malaya remained completely silent. He claimed she didn't want to talk, that she was overwhelmed, and that he was simply handling things for her. But in context, it looked more like control than care. His voice filled the silence around her and made it his own. Leaving no space for her own, even after Malaya left him, Daniel continued to suggest that she hadn't acted of her own free will, that others had gotten into her head. Once again, it wasn't about accepting the truth. It was about maintaining control over the version of events. He framed her departure as part of a larger campaign against him, rather than an act of self-liberation. Over time, his posture shifted, from defensive to dismissive. He said he was done explaining himself, that no one was listening anyway. But this wasn't humility. It was disengagement, the classic retreat of someone who realizes they're no longer in control of the story. And as Daniel began to fade from public view, so did any remaining credibility he once had. His attempt to cast himself as the victim, the one wronged, misunderstood, and mistreated, fell apart under the weight of his own behavior. It didn't align with the facts, it didn't earn trust, and it never once centered on the two children who were truly gone. In the end, what became most striking wasn't just what Daniel said, it was what he refused to say, what he refused to show. The missing urgency, the absence of emotion, the silence where love should have been. That's why, despite all his efforts to appear wounded and unfairly accused, the community, and eventually even Malaya, turned away. Weeks after Malaya left, Daniel vanished, not physically, but from the conversation he had once dominated. The man who had tirelessly posted updates, defended his character, and responded to every accusation suddenly fell silent. He stopped replying to comments. No new posts, no more explanations, just quiet. It was a dramatic contrast to the voice that had once echoed loudly across every thread related to Lilly and Jack's disappearance. For months, Daniel had shaped the public narrative. He didn't just represent himself, he spoke for both of them. He used we language constantly, presenting a united front that in hindsight looked more like a performance. Once Malaya was gone, that illusion collapsed. There was no one left for him to speak on behalf of, and without that framing, it became clear he'd been speaking alone all along, controlling the message without permission. The silence that followed wasn't just noticeable, it was chilling. The same silence he'd once imposed on Malaya now engulfed him. And to many, that didn't look like grief. It looked calculated. Some theorized the police had told him to stop talking, but no evidence ever confirmed that. Others believed it was simply the moment he realized he'd lost control. The words ran out. The story could no longer be held together. What made it more unsettling was the timing. There was no big development in the case, no new evidence, just the quiet. That quiet moment when Malaya walked away, and with her went his entire structure, his audience, his support, his excuse. The man who had built a digital fortress of control was suddenly nowhere to be found. He had silenced everyone else for so long, and now there was no one left to speak for him. Is Daniel lying? In the weeks after the case began attracting national attention, A woman surfaced online claiming to be Daniel Martell's former partner and the mother of one of his children. What she shared quickly added fuel to a fire already burning with suspicion. She didn't speak vaguely. She didn't offer cryptic warnings. She laid it all out. According to her, Daniel wasn't just controlling, he was dangerous. She described a relationship marked by escalating manipulation, isolation, and emotional degradation. At one point, she claimed, he dictated what she could eat, what she could wear, and even who she was allowed to talk to. Friends, family, all cut off. Then came the part that shocked even those already skeptical of him. She alleged that Daniel had a history of drug use, not just past experimentation, but behavior that raised serious concerns during their relationship. According to her, it wasn't something that stayed in the past. It was part of the chaos, the mood swings, the paranoia, the volatility. She implied it played a direct role in why the court eventually revoked his parental rights. The control wasn't just emotional. She recounted being physically pushed while pregnant. She spoke of threats, of being denied access to finances, of Daniel using her own struggles, including postpartum depression, as a weapon. According to her, when she began to break down emotionally, Daniel flipped the script and painted her as the unstable one. It's a tactic well documented in coercive relationships, gaslighting through reversal, making the victim question their own reality while the abuser sharpens his control. Perhaps the most telling detail? She said she eventually won full custody of their daughter, not because Daniel gave up, but because the court deemed him unfit. And she didn't come forward just to settle scores. Her words were clear, "I'm speaking up now because I'm terrified he might hurt another child." That's not resentment, that's a warning. The story she told bears an uncomfortable resemblance to what would later unfold with Malaya Brooks Murray. Both women allegedly faced isolation, not just geographically, but socially and psychologically. Both saw their connections to family and friends erode. Both lived in homes where Daniel was the only voice being heard. And both, it seems, were erased, first emotionally, then publicly. No official statement has come from Daniel responding to these claims. No denials, no clarifications. His silence has been deafening. Whether it's due to legal strategy or avoidance is unclear, but in a case built on what people say and what they choose not to, that silence speaks volumes. The woman's claims have not been independently verified by law enforcement. There is no court transcript or police record currently available to confirm every detail. Still, her story fits a pattern. Her warning wasn't random. It was consistent, credible, and echoed by others who've observed Daniel's behavior up close. When viewed in the broader timeline, her appearance in the public conversation was not a distraction. It was a revelation. It gave context, history, and a chilling reminder that control, when left unchecked, often escalates. Sometimes until someone gets hurt. On the side of those following this case, many people have tried to analyze what Daniel said from the very beginning. And from the start, Daniel Martell's language raised red flags. He didn't speak like a distraught stepfather. He spoke like someone carefully crafting a version of events he could control. One of the first things people noticed was Daniel's constant use of we instead of she. Malaya never spoke publicly. She never posted. She never appeared on camera. Daniel used we as a substitute for her voice, masking the fact that he was the only one talking. This pattern went deeper. Daniel repeatedly spoke on behalf of Malaya, even when no one asked him to. She's resting. She agrees with me. She doesn't want to talk. These weren't updates. They were claims of ownership over someone else's autonomy. Throughout the investigation, there was no verifiable communication from Malaya herself. Everything passed through Daniel. It wasn't care, it was control. When scrutiny increased, Daniel shifted his language from cooperative to combative. Instead of addressing public concern about the children, he redirected attention to his own discomfort. "Everyone wants to blame me. You don't know what we've been through." This wasn't grief. It was deflection. He portrayed criticism as persecution, turning public suspicion into a personal attack and placing himself at the center of the emotional storm. Another recurring tactic was how Daniel handled disagreement, especially from family members or community voices. When someone contradicted his version of events, he dismissed them outright. "You weren't there. They've done it before, you just didn't see." These statements are textbook gaslighting, recasting past events to invalidate others' experiences while reinforcing his own narrative. Even his moral posture felt rehearsed. He often leaned on phrases like, "We've done everything we could," or "No one knows what we've been through." Attempts to wrap himself in virtue, preempting criticism before it arrived. This wasn't a man pleading for help. It was someone shielding himself with self-righteousness. Perhaps most disturbing was how Daniel re-centered the story around his own suffering. "I lost them too. No one ever sees what I did for them." He wasn't just a grieving stepfather. He became the emotional center of the narrative, often overshadowing even Malaya, the children's biological mother. This emotional hijacking reframed the entire tragedy around his pain, not the missing kids. What's also striking is what Daniel didn't say. At no point did he use emotionally charged words like love, terrified, or desperate. He never begged for help. He never pleaded with the public. He never asked questions like, "If anyone saw anything, please come forward." That kind of omission speaks volumes. In true crime cases, genuine desperation is impossible to fake, and Daniel didn't even try. His storytelling also blurred boundaries. He often merged his voice with Malaya's, claiming, "We just want peace," or "She's been through enough." This blending of perspectives, called narrative weaving, makes it hard to tell where his voice ended and hers began, where his thoughts end and hers begin. That's the point. It keeps the listener confused, and it keeps Daniel in control. Obviously, Daniel's language wasn't just how he communicated, it was how he dominated. And as the investigation progressed, it became clear. The more pressure mounted, the more his control slipped. And once Malaya left, once he could no longer speak for her, his entire narrative began to collapse. His voice, once everywhere, disappeared, and in its place, the silence said more than words ever could. In the wake of the children's disappearance and Malaya's sudden departure, one fact began to emerge quietly but firmly. Daniel Martell was no longer allowed to see his daughter Meadow. According to multiple sources, some from the community, others who claimed to know the family personally, Daniel had been issued a temporary no-contact order. He was prohibited from visiting Meadow, taking her out, or being near her in any unsupervised setting. Though no public court documents have yet confirmed this, the consistency of the reports is telling. The information was repeated across independent sources, each aligning with the reality already playing out. Malaya had left the home, taking Meadow with her, and since then, Daniel has had zero known contact with the only child still alive and linked to him by blood. This kind of court order is not granted lightly. To ban a biological father from his child, especially in the aftermath of a crisis, requires substantial concern. It suggests that law enforcement, the courts, or child protection services had valid reason to believe Daniel posed a risk to Meadow's well-being. Whether that risk stemmed from past psychological harm, coercive behaviors, or a larger ongoing investigation, we don't know. But we can infer this. There was enough cause to act, legally. Daniel may still hold parental rights on paper, but functionally, those rights are gone. He doesn't see Meadow. He doesn't talk to her. He doesn't even mention her anymore. In his earlier public statements, Daniel often centered himself as the all-sacrificing father. "I did everything for those kids." Now, the silence surrounding Meadow is total, and it cuts deeper than any admission. His voice, once loud and dominating, fell quiet the moment she was no longer in reach. What does this silence say? That the last pillar of his identity, the one rooted in fatherhood, has been removed. And without it, the structure he'd built around himself collapsed. His media presence faded. The updates stopped. The defensive comments vanished. Daniel wasn't just losing custody, he was losing control. Meanwhile, Meadow and Malaya were reportedly living in a safe, undisclosed location. Some speculate they're under the guidance of social services, perhaps even within a victim protection program. The RCMP reportedly advised Malaya to stay silent, possibly as a condition of protective measures. If Daniel was deemed a continuing threat, that silence might not just be strategic, but essential. He hasn't contested the no-contact order publicly. He hasn't even acknowledged it. That silence may be a legal tactic, or resignation. Either way, it speaks, because Meadow is not just a child. She's Daniel's biological link to legitimacy, to public sympathy, and perhaps to his own sense of self. If the court believed that even brief, supervised contact was unsafe, that level of risk signals something significant. The rumors go further. Some believe Daniel is banned from messaging or calling Meadow and Malaya entirely. No texts, no emails, no indirect contact through others. Again, no paperwork has surfaced to confirm this, but the complete blackout in his communication supports the idea. And if this isn't just about Meadow, but about a pattern, then it's likely there were signs before. Some in the community speculate that child protection had already flagged Daniel long before May 2nd, and that the tragedy of Lilly and Jack might have been the final breaking point in a case quietly unfolding behind closed doors. The expansion and redirection of the investigation were later officially confirmed, and Daniel was part of it. He was among the earliest individuals considered a person of interest. When the disappearance of Lilly and Jack first made headlines, it was treated with urgency, but not necessarily suspicion. That changed when RCMP confirmed they had engaged their truth verification unit and that polygraph tests had been conducted on some of the 54 individuals interviewed. This marked a critical turning point. While RCMP officials did not reveal who took the tests, how many people were tested, or the results, the mere fact that polygraph examinations were administered was significant. According to former Ontario Provincial Police polygraph examiner Chris Lewis, these tests are not used for casual witnesses or distant associates. They are reserved for people suspected of involvement or those whose accounts don't hold up under scrutiny. One of the individuals who publicly acknowledged taking the polygraph was Daniel Martell, the children's stepfather. In a media interview, Daniel said he was the first to volunteer. He positioned this act as a gesture of transparency, claiming he wanted to reduce speculation and help the investigation. But to many, the move seemed strategic, a performative attempt to appear cooperative, especially amid rising public suspicion. Daniel's public statements during this time reflected a distinct shift in tone. Rather than focusing on the children's welfare, his language turned inward. "I lost them too," he said, and complained that people had already decided he was to blame. These were not statements of grief. They were statements of self-victimization, a classic rhetorical maneuver often used to deflect growing scrutiny. His language centered his own emotional experience, while the children remained missing. Compounding public concern was a key legal development. Daniel revealed that he had not been allowed to see his biological daughter Meadow since the incident. He added that only supervised visitation would be permitted in the near future. Though no court order has been made public, this limitation strongly suggests that Daniel was no longer considered a safe or stable guardian by either family court or child protective services. Meanwhile, RCMP investigators made it clear that the case had escalated beyond a simple missing persons report. In a formal statement, they emphasized, until proven otherwise, every missing persons investigation is considered suspicious. This is more than boilerplate caution. It signals that foul play has not been ruled out, and may in fact be the primary working theory. Supporting this shift is the confirmation that RCMP obtained multiple judicial authorizations to seize and examine phones, digital devices, and materials. Such steps are typically reserved for criminal probes, not mere welfare checks. Put together, the polygraph testing, Daniel's linguistic pivot to self-pity, the restricted access to Meadow, and the scale of the digital seizure reveal a clear progression. In the investigation, from a missing child alert to a criminal inquiry, no arrests have been made, no suspect has been officially named. But every move by law enforcement and every crack in Daniel's public persona suggests a case where control, perception, and truth are all under forensic examination. A domestic incident covered up. Among all the possible scenarios surrounding the disappearance of Lilly and Jack Sullivan, the theory most frequently discussed and most closely tied to Daniel Martell is the one known as a domestic incident covered up. The central premise of this theory is stark. Lilly and Jack Sullivan did not simply wander off. Their disappearance was not the result of a natural accident, nor the act of an outside threat. Instead, something happened inside that house, something serious, possibly fatal. And what followed was not a desperate search for missing children, but a calculated effort to cover it up. At the heart of this theory lies Daniel Martell. On the morning of May 2nd, he was reportedly the only adult present. He was the one who made the initial public claims that the children had just walked away. He was also the one who controlled every narrative, every update, and every line of communication in the critical hours and days following the disappearance. No one else spoke, not even their mother, Malaya. It was his voice, and only his voice, shaping what the public knew. The theory suggests that Daniel may have either directly caused harm or witnessed an unintended tragedy and then chose not to report it. Instead of calling emergency services right away, he may have taken steps to stage a different story, one where the children simply wandered off into the woods. In this version, the narrative was curated from the very start, the timeline controlled, the scene potentially cleaned up before authorities arrived. What could have happened? Possible scenarios include a violent outburst, a drug-related accident, or a moment of negligence that led to injury or death. Daniel's past, including allegations of emotional control, domestic violence, and substance abuse, adds context to the theory. Some believe this incident may have been the culmination of long-standing dangerous behaviors that had finally spiraled beyond concealment. The motivation for such a cover-up could be multifaceted: fear of prosecution, fear of losing custody of his daughter Meadow, fear of public disgrace. If authorities had already been watching the home, if prior reports or incidents existed, the stakes would have been even higher for Daniel. And if this wasn't the first time he had skirted the line of legality, the pressure to hide the truth would have only intensified. Crucially, this theory doesn't rely on the existence of an external perpetrator. It doesn't look for threats in the forest or strangers on the road. It points inward, to the house, to the man in control, to the silence that followed. It asks, not who took the children, but what really happened inside that home. And why isn't anyone telling the truth? This theory began gaining traction once Malaya left Daniel, once supervised visitation with Meadow was enforced, and once Daniel's language, behavior, and silence became public objects of scrutiny. The pattern, many argue, was always there. But only after the system around Daniel began to crack did the gravity of that pattern become too sharp to ignore. There are several good reasons why this theory is popular. In debates. First, there are serious contradictions in the timeline and in Daniel Martell's version of events. His story about the children wandering off doesn't quite add up. The house is located deep in a remote wooded area, terrain that's difficult even for adults to navigate, especially in early May. For two young kids to simply walk away from such an environment without anyone noticing and without leaving a trace has always sounded suspicious. The gaps and inconsistencies in what Daniel said, and when he said it, raised more questions than they answered. Second, despite extensive searches, with helicopters, drones, scent dogs, and hundreds of volunteers, not a single piece of biological or physical evidence has ever been found. No clothing, no shoes, no scent trail, nothing. That kind of complete absence is extremely rare in cases where children simply go missing outdoors. It has led many to believe the disappearance didn't happen the way it was described, and may not have happened outside the house at all. Then there's Daniel's personal history. His ex-girlfriend and others confirmed he has a background of controlling behavior, emotional abuse, and even drug use, including methamphetamine. He lost custody of his daughter Meadow and was later restricted from seeing her without supervision. All of this paints a troubling picture of a man who might be capable of more than just manipulation. Daniel's behavior after the children went missing also raises red flags. He took over the public narrative almost immediately, speaking not only for himself, but for Malaya as well. He described the situation using carefully controlled language, avoided emotional appeals, and framed himself as the victim. These patterns, combined with his refusal to allow Malaya to speak, suggest a deliberate effort to manage perception rather than to help find the kids. The investigation itself also supports the idea that something more serious may have happened. The RCMP confirmed they used polygraph tests on a select number of people, a tactic typically reserved for suspects or individuals under serious scrutiny. Daniel says he was the first to volunteer, but experts note polygraphs aren't used casually. Law enforcement must have had significant concerns to deploy that tool. Finally, the police have repeatedly said this case is considered suspicious. They've executed judicial warrants to seize phones and devices, coordinated with multiple agencies, and refused to clear anyone publicly. That silence is telling. It means this isn't just a search. Even though the theory makes sense on several levels, there are major questions that remain unanswered. The most pressing: what exactly happened to Lilly and Jack? If this was a cover-up, what was being covered? Was it a tragic accident? A moment of uncontrolled anger? An overdose or injury? And if the children are no longer alive, where are their remains? The complete lack of physical evidence is part of what makes this theory both compelling and deeply frustrating. It's hard to prove what's been perfectly hidden. Another important question: did Daniel act alone? All signs point to Malaya having been heavily controlled during her time living with him. But does that mean she didn't know what happened? Or was she also silenced or coerced into going along with something? Police have interviewed more than 50 people, leaving open the possibility that someone else knows more and hasn't come forward yet. Then there's the issue of legal action, or the lack of it. Daniel hasn't been charged. That doesn't necessarily mean he's innocent. It could simply mean police are waiting for stronger evidence, waiting on lab results from digital devices, or seeking cooperation from someone close to the case. Building a criminal case without a body is notoriously difficult. Finally, if this really was something deliberate, what was the motive? Was Daniel afraid of losing custody again? Was it a violent outburst that went too far? Or is there something even darker beneath the surface? The theory leads to heavy possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. What's clear is this: the idea that something happened inside that house and that someone knows the truth but isn't saying remains the theory that refuses to go away. And as long as Lilly and Jack remain missing, it's a theory that deserves to be taken seriously. The disappearance of Lilly and Jack Sullivan is a tragedy, but it's also a cautionary tale, one that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about control, silence, and the hidden violence that can exist behind closed doors. One of the most unsettling lessons from this case is how easy it is for someone to control not just another person, but an entire narrative. For over a year, Daniel Martell spoke for everyone, for the children, for Malaya, for the family. He crafted a version of events that positioned him as the concerned stepfather and grieving parent. But beneath that polished surface were red flags: emotional isolation, psychological control, and an overwhelming dominance of the story. And no one questioned it. Not at first. It also shows how coercive control doesn't always look like violence. It can look like someone managing all communication, someone who takes care of everything, someone who convinces you they're just doing what's best. But the effect is the same, the erasure of another person's agency. In this case, it was Malaya's silence that spoke volumes. Her absence from the media, her lack of independent statements, and eventually her physical departure from Daniel's home. All of it painted a quiet, haunting picture of control. This case reminds us that when someone suddenly goes silent or stops showing up, we shouldn't always assume they're fine. Disappearance doesn't always begin with the body. It begins with the voice, with social media accounts that go dark, with friends and family being pushed away, with one person speaking for two. We also learn how systems, legal, social, familial, can be slow to respond. Daniel had prior allegations, custody issues, and visible signs of controlling behavior. And yet he remained in a position of power for far too long. This delay can be deadly. It teaches us the importance of early intervention, of listening when someone says they're scared, and of believing survivors when they step forward. Finally, the greatest takeaway is this: no child just disappears without a trace. When the facts don't make sense, we must not be afraid to ask harder questions. We owe that to Lilly and Jack, and to every child whose story might be slipping through the cracks while adults maintain their silence. Truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it's buried under everything that isn't said.